Okay, hi everybody. I think we're just going to wait a couple more minutes to let people trickle in, and we will get started with the presentation. Thank you for joining us. Actually, I think we have good numbers now, so we can just go ahead and get right into it. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this webinar looking at the topic of sustainable finance and de-risking for carbon capture and storage. I'm Eleanor. I'm the Climate and Energy Manager at IPICA. And IPICA is the Global Oil and Gas Association for advancing environmental and social performance across the energy transition. We have been championing good practice for over 50 years, and I'm pleased to welcome you all here today. I would firstly like to share a special thank you to our webinar series partners, which are SPE CCUS Technical Section, SPE Gaia, OGCI, and IOGP. As part of this webinar series, we have held 3 webinars, one on social acceptance, one on CO2 enhanced oil recovery, and another on permitting to development. This is the last webinar in this series, so please refer to IPICA's homepage for more information about future events. We will put any relevant links in the chat box. Today's webinar will be moderated by Shannon Gray, IPICA's CCS Task Force co-chair. And before I pass over to him, I would just like to cover some housekeeping items. So there will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar. To ask any question, please access the Q&A function to post questions there. Participants are unable to unmute or turn their camera on unless hosts enable permission. However, we encourage you to post questions into the chat box. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared to registrants after the webinar has concluded. Finally, the use of other external AI-powered recording or transcription tools is prohibited, so please deactivate any you have installed now, and we will remove any we see in the meeting. That is all from me for now, and I'll pass on to Shannon for some opening words. Thank you. Shannon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. And hello, everyone, for tuning in. As Eleanor mentioned, this is our 4th and final CCS webinar in the IPICA 2025-2026 webinar season. Thank you for tuning in. If you've seen the last 3, you know kind of the state of play. We have 2 fantastic speakers from the industry today. I'll briefly do some introductions. I'll let them continue those introductions and then give an overview of sustainable finance and de-risking carbon capture and storage. So our first speaker for the webinar today is going to be Katerina DeMathis, who's a Senior Policy Manager at IOGP Europe. Katerina is going to give kind of the ins and outs of what's going on in Europe. We're going to see some of the policy choices kind of within that region and some of the suggestions around some of the programs that are currently being implemented for storage. After that, Peter Paul Eccleshott from ING Solutions, who's a global lead for low carbon solutions, is going to be giving a background on financing, primarily focusing on the role that financing plays in de-risking some of these solutions for Europe's climate goals and how that can be interpreted by and the broader markets for de-risking and bankability in CCS projects. And with that, I'll pass it over to Katerina.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm Katerina DeMathis, a Senior Policy Manager at IOGP based in Brussels, where I deal with energy and climate issues, in particular with a strong focus on CCS. Today, I will give you an overview of policies around CCS with a special focus on Europe. And I will talk about also particular topic and particular instrument we have been looking at IOGP. So before starting, I'll give you an introduction of who is IOGP. We are the global voice of our industry, the oil and gas industry, pioneering excellence, safe, efficient, and sustainable energy supply. we are building on our strong foundation on the expertise, engineering our way through a department focusing on the energy transition and leading through agility, vision, and collaboration. We have 94 members globally, and I will focus today on the European dimension. In IOGP Europe, we focus on EU policies. We have the European voice of the industry, based in Brussels at the center of advocacy activity. And we have engaging on a regular basis with policymakers, setting the necessary condition to enable oil and gas industry, and developing position statements and the policy activities and policy mechanisms supporting the EU policies for the development of activity related to oil and gas. We had a strong focus on CCS as is part of our DNA to have experience in the subsurface. And as IOGP, we participate in different platforms at EU level to engage with policymakers on this topic. I will start by giving you an overview of where the policies in the EU are for CCS and what was their evolution. So with in 2009, it was CCS directive which established for the first time a setting for CO2 storage operations, ensuring long-term liability and monitoring activities post-closure, and also aligning with the carbon mechanisms, the EU ETS. In the 2020, so after that, there was something at strategic level. CCS did not have really a big place. And it was with the climate law and the EU taxonomy that the recognition of CCS about solution, enabling solution for decarbonization and keeping competitiveness of the industry was launched. And this was formalized later on with the ICM strategy, the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy, with outlining the vision for CCS, CCU, and carbon removals, what is represented industrial carbon management, and proposed the creation of a European CO2 infrastructure network. So this strategy included a set of actions with encompasses all the activities of CCS. A big policy which you may heard of is the Net Zero Industry Act, which came in 2024, entering into force into 2024. Net Zero Industry Act. Net Zero Industry Act introduce an EU-wide target of 50 million tons of CO2 annual injection capacity by 2030, and includes an obligation for oil and gas producers to contribute to the storage development. So the oil and gas producers, based on their past production in Europe, has a legal obligation to contribute to this target. And a delegated act listed the 44 obligated entities, obligated companies, which are obliged to provide these storage services. And the timeline is relatively short compared to the actions stemming from the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy are at the level. I would like to dive into now the CO2 storage projects in Europe, because this is what matters to monitor the progress towards the NZIA target. And in IOGP Europe, we monitor the project development, looking in particular at where the storage has been made, what progress are ongoing, and we just updated this slide recently. I think the key issue here is that, in the European Union, which is what matters for the 50 million ton target, we are only at 0.68 million ton per annum in operation today. And of these, only 0.025 million tons are eligible to Net Zero Industry Act, because one detail of Net Zero Industry Act is also that EOR operation are not eligible for reaching the target. So this leaves with a quite big gap towards the target, but also in particular, I think the other message is that what we saw in this new update is that we had some the FID level, the progress of the project is not at the level expected, and that there are significant delays towards the target and the entry into operation of the project. For this reason, it's really challenging today, appears really challenging from 4 years to enter into force to reach the NZIA target. And just to give you a little bit more background of what I said, the objective of Net Zero Industry Act is to boost EU manufacturing. The Net Zero Industry Act has also provision to streamline administrative and permitting processes for net zero strategics such as CCS. However, this level of action needed for reaching the target by 2050, the obligation is left only to one part of the value chain, which are the storage providers with such an obligation. In sum, to reach this ambition, given the condition of the market, we need to have a set of actions. In IOGP in Europe, we see these three main priorities: funding and de-risking, of course, and I will dig into that quite in detail. So specific mechanisms such as a carbon contract for difference embedded in EU policies. Important project of common interest, which is a tool which has been used for hydrogen, for instance, in Europe, that we believe could be used, should be leveraged for CCS as well, and continuous R&I investments in capture technology. It's also important to build out an infrastructure, and this infrastructure should come in phases. The EU will come with the rules for the CO2 infrastructure in later this year through the CO2 markets and infrastructure proposal. What we believe is this approach should be phased, setting some general principle, but not constraining the market into rigid rules, which could be detrimental. Other important aspect is coordinate across the border. So leveraging the progress made in the North Sea, in particular in the UK and Norway. And for this to happen, there should be alignment of incentive mechanisms and encouraging bilateral agreement. And we celebrate these days, in particular, the signature of a memorandum of understanding between UK and Belgium regarding CCS. This is just one example of what is needed for cross-border cooperation, also in terms of real engagement and real agreements. But today I will start from the business case, which is always a big theme for CCS. Is really the missing piece. And what we notice in the EU, no surprise, the cost of the EU ETS, which is the main driver for emitters to decarbonize, is not the level which needed to unlock the project. The levelized cost of CCS, according to the analysis we did in IOGP, through a paper where we analyzed the needs for a business case along the full value chains, are estimated around 130 and 230 per ton of CO2. And in this cost range, the capture account for 53 to 80% of the total aggregated cost. The ETS allowance price, however, is fluctuating between 72 and 89 euro per ton of CO2. So that significantly shows that there is a need to cover this gap, and because the signal is not yet sufficient. And when we talk about CCS, it's important to stress that this is a value chain. So capture matters, of course, because for storage operators is important to have the commitment from storage and transport operator to be able to store, but also all the value chain, of course, should be de-risked. And from what we saw, we look at the different options available for the different segments, and emitters can use CCFD, targeting funding, long-term CO2 offset contracts, and government. While government could play a role in establishing the transport infrastructure through banking with guarantees, long-term backup capacity bookings, and in some cases, regulated tariffs. Regarding the storage, what matters more for the storage is having the commitment from the emitters, and of course, a framework which allows also for cross-border adjustments, cross-border accounting, bilateral agreements, and all that provides a framework which also from a legal point of view is feasible. And this matters in particular between EU and non-EU countries. To unlock this, what we believe is fundamental that member states need to take the necessary measures, providing their support, lift bans where the bans for CO2 storage is still existing, which is a reality for some of the member states. And also to focus on pushing for the continuous acknowledgement of the role of CCS and for stressing the action needing, in particular on funding and de-risking. When we look at really what we could do in practice to unlock CCS, we thought about what we called the CCS bank, which is not a bank per se, but is an instrument which will be provided under some EU funding instrument of the some for policy and for funding instrument from the EU. And what we are looking at, we looked at in particular the Innovation Fund, which today with a budget of 40 billion in total is the main instrument for decarbonization of funding instrument for decarbonization projects, and in particular CCS1. What we believe the CCS bank would add is to embed competitive auction mechanism under the Innovation Fund based on transparent, cost-efficient allocation of funds and reduce administrative process. And why we thought about this, it's because a similar mechanism was already included, has been included in the Innovation Fund for hydrogen and was called Hydrogen Bank. It's a small case, but for the hydrogen, we believe it could be a good model to replicate at a much bigger scale for CCS. And the reason why we think that this is an efficient process is because it has several characteristics. First of all, transparency and cost efficiency. The budget allocation will be granted to projects with the highest cost efficiency while achieving maximum emission reduction. It will allow at the same time also to have price discovery and market information, because it will be a transparent process where you will collect aggregated data and insight into the sector and the market. And also one of the big advantages will leverage private capital being based on a carbon mechanisms, and will unlock the additional private investments, meaning the delta with the EU ETS price. Overall, it will also reduce administrative burden and alleviate the burden, which is often coming from applying to EU funding process, which requires significant administrative support. So if we look at in more detail how this CCS bank will build on the success of the hydrogen bank, there are similarities. Both instruments would work on competitive bidding, leveraging transparency, price discovery, and reducing administrative burden. While there are some differences, while Hydrogen Bank has some fixed premium, the CCS bank will be based on flexible CCFD funding scheme. The other similarities, and this is, I think, an interesting element, is will be, of course, because EU has a limited budget, the member states will have to complement the available funding through what is called grant as a service principle. The other difference, of course, is while the Hydrogen Bank was quite technology prescriptive and restricted only to green hydrogen, the CCS Bank will be much more technology neutral, open to all ETS-related sector without technology basket or sectorial prioritization. Looking in detail how we made this to work. Yes.
Just quick time check. About 3 minutes left.
Yes.
For your presentation,
thank you for
and
the
then we'll
reminder.
switch to ING. No problem.
Yeah, but I'm heading toward the end, so this is perfect timing. We looked at how the auction process will work, and it will be an auction launch through a pre-qualification phase where the key requirements will be submitted by applicants, and then the bid evaluation process will value criteria such as the highest emission reduction for the most cost-efficient solution. There will be publication of results with signature of agreements, and then the CCFD disbursement. Based on a clear criteria, a completion bond, and a time frame. So here we looked at how the CCFD, other big advantage is how it will be dispersed over time, is the fact that as time goes up south, the market develops, the subsidy portion will be reduced. So this is really what has a clear advantage. I will end here, and I'm happy to take any question further. But what my message here is that we have indication that this can also materialize into some concrete funding tools through what the Commission already presented in big lines, and will be the Industrial Decarbonization Bank. So we believe that somehow the concept that is mentioned is as being mentioned by many stakeholders relevant, and we believe it will have a place in this new funding architecture that the European Commission is planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katerina. And I think that's a great transition from our colleagues at IOGP Europe talking about some of the current policy and potential funding, I'll call them opportunities, that could potentially be addressed by other fund mechanisms in Europe to help deploy CCS and decarbonization technologies. We have Peter Paul from ING here to have an overview of what financing and risk allocation across the CCUS value chain can entail. Peter Paul, you're going to have about 20 minutes for presentation, and then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, whenever you're ready.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you, Katerina, for the previous presentation. I think there's going to be quite some topics that will come back in mine. So my name is Peter Paul Ekelschot. I'm within ING, part of the energy sector team, and responsible for the global push we have around low carbon solutions. So both the CCS part and but also the green molecules. And obviously that's an area that is in quite nice development. Have been with the bank for around 20 years in both M&A, restructuring, and oil and gas upstream financing. So have seen a bit of everything, and now more focused on, let's say, the green molecules. So very quickly, a little bit of marketing. ING is a Dutch bank, but we have quite a strong, not only European foothold, but a global footprint. Obviously, our strength is in Europe, and last year we were the largest bank financing across the energy sector. I think it's fair to say that if you look at all the different segments, we are not only financing the molecules, but also the renewables, and obviously the utilities and, let's say, the pipelines. And this is really a global team with a lot of local teams, but really across the globe, covering all the products and a very wide number of clients across both financial investors to, let's say, the traditional energy companies. So we are part of Carbon Management Europe, and that is we're one of the co-chairs for the finance work group, really trying to push also the finance agenda on everything carbon capture and CDR related. Because I think it's often a overlooked area that requires quite some specific attention. If you then ask what's your experience with CCS, so I think it's fair to say that we are involved in the vast majority of the situations globally. So obviously in EMEA, where our strongest footprint is, we're financing on a project finance basis, let's say, the projects in the UK, NEP, NZT, but also we recently stepped into the HyNet holdco financing. But we're also currently involved with a number of debt and equity raises in the UK. And then if you look at the Nordics, we've been focusing a lot on, let's say, a number of M&A and advisory situations. In the US, we are financing also a very nice integrated capture to storage project called Tallgrass, which is developed by a number of infrastructure parties. And obviously in the Netherlands, where our home market is, we are involved in all the different situations there, both on the financing side, but also, let's say, on the advisory side. And in Greece, also nice to mention, we are helping Energy and with a debt raise for the Prinos project. So that's the quick intro. Then if you look at, what are key developments, and this is a little bit obviously a banker's view, less of a policy view, but I just want to walk you through. Obviously, the majors are still key parts of driving the decarbonization and creating the transport and storage. And we've seen a lot of news flow about decreased investments. And I think that's especially true on the SAF and the green molecule side, and obviously also on the renewables side, especially offshore wind. But carbon capture is still an important part of the agenda, albeit all the old are, let's say, upsizing, right-sizing, or let's say refocusing their attention, and rather than looking at multiple projects, they're really assessing the viability of which projects are going to be able to come to market soonest. So that's obviously let me driving also. So that's a little bit more of a general backdrop. If you then look at the different projects that we have seen in Europe that have actually come to FID, there are not that many. So there's 6 projects, actually 5, and Ravenna is a little bit of a trial project. But 5 big projects that have actually taken FID. So the NEP and the HyNet projects, or the Liverpool Bay projects, they've taken FID in December 24 and in let's say summer 25, really backstopped by a UK government. But I'll come back to that on the next slide with a bit more background. Longship is obviously a project that took FID as well. They recently took FID for the phase 2. I think one of the key drivers for that one is that the Norwegian government really stepped in and paid for, let's say, 70, 85 to 85% of the underlying capex and opex for the phase 1 of that project. So, i.e., de-risking it's quite significantly. If you then look at Portos, that's obviously also a project where the 3, so it's more of a joint development agreement that was put in place between emitters and, let's say, the developers, and the developers being ABN, Port of Rotterdam, and GasUnie, all 3 of them directly or indirectly state-owned. Hence being able to be a bit more forward-leaning, but also one of the reasons that project could come to FID is that ultimately with 4 emitters, Shell, Exxon, Air Liquides, and Air Products, they were able to really develop it together. It was not a massive project with, let's say, a lot of uncertainties at the emitter side, but all those projects were able to give, let's say, the relevant guarantees in terms of emissions, but also storage to each other. There were some delays that have really impacted, let's say, the IRR of that project, but still they took FID. I think GreenSense is a very interesting one, developed by Ineos and Harbour, Ineos being the operator. And I think one of the key drivers for that project, obviously, yes, they got some subsidies that de-risked their costs, but they were able to really drive down costs for that project quite a bit. And also a lot of the economics are in the postponement of, let's say, the ABEX for that project. And that really helped create economics for that project. I think the selection of the other projects here in gray, that's more, let's say, the project that in our discussions with developers we see as more advanced, but obviously there's more than 80 projects in EMEA, as Katerina mentioned in the previous presentation. So if you then look indeed at why some of those projects reach FID, and obviously very generic remarks, but and I think that's also one of the ways we look at it. And there was a bit of a cluster approach on let's say Portos, East Coast cluster, and HyNet, i.e., starting small but really a hub approach with the intention to build out later. I think the phased approach was more with Northern Lights, GreenSense, and Ravenna, i.e., starting relatively smaller with the intention to take FID for the next phases relatively soon thereafter. Some takeaways, obviously project phasing, quite important. It's not easy to get, let's say, the volumes committed on day one. And I think that's one of the main challenges for the projects. having a cornerstone emitter helps. Obviously on portals, joint development. For NEP, it was obviously the NZT, which is also BP and Equinor. But I think the other elements, strong government involvement from day one, whether it's on the funding side or really on the coordination side. I think DESNES has played a very important role on getting all the stakeholders aligned. Risk allocation, the projects that have taken FID, I think ultimately were quite well funded, and a lot of the risks were taken away from, let's say, the developers, either on the let's say the funding side or on the main risk side. Then if you look at the main risks, and I'll come back to that later, obviously the volume ramp-up risk, construction, project on project risk, and then operational performance and subservience risks. I think all of those main risks need to be addressed to ensure financing is put in place. So if you then look at and Katrina already mentioned this, a number of elements that I think are quite important to further drive the market. One is, let's say, the lead market concept that's being developed in Europe, and that's really create demand for green products, and we see that especially on the steel, the green cement, and aluminium side, where public procurement will, or at least that's the intention, will need to include a minimum percentage of green cement, for example. And if you then understand that 50% of the let's say the sales of cement in Europe are for public building, railways, metro systems, etc. Having such a lead market concept really will help drive demand for that product. And obviously the decarbonization bank that Katrina mentioned earlier, I think that is going to be very helpful to, amalgamate, let's say, all the different funds of the European Commission, put that together and have that allocated, in let's say one hand rather than all the different departments. I think one other element, and this is something that we are driving also through CMA, so the Carbon Management Europe, is a kind of a guarantee mechanism, especially for low probability, high impact issues. At the moment, there's no real insurance market for carbon capture, but obviously in order to make this bankable and also investable, a number of those risks will need to be backstopped. I think the other element is let's say the NZEA that also Katrina mentioned. This is some data that was put together by Wellington, where you see, let's say, the obligations more on a shareholder level. The obligations are typically on a per country basis for the operators. But I think this provides quite a nice picture, and especially also if you then look at, let's say, the announced storage capacity, there will be some surpluses and some minuses, and I think that's probably going to lead to some valorization in the future. I know there's a lot of discussions on the NZEA. A lot of the obligated parties, are not do not agree with, let's say, the obligations. And to be fair, there are quite some gaps in it in terms of, knowing that UK, Norway are not included, where the majority of, let's say, the storage is being developed, but also the fact that this is based on historical production. On the other hand, I think the EU is also relatively flexible is not the right word. They say this is what it is, but at the same time they acknowledge, let's say, the shortcomings, but really want to incentivize the oil and gas companies to start investing in storage. So that was, let's say, on the policy part and what's driving the different products. But then if you look at, let's say, the products, and I know this is a very complicated overview, but the key message I want to give to you is that the contractual relationships for those projects are super complex. Even if you are an emitter, you think you would only have one contract with, let's say, the transportation and storage, but then also in the transport and storage contracts, there's all kind of disintermediation. There will be, let's say, the intermediate storage. There will be, let's say, maybe some shipping or trucking. There will be, let's say, a receiving terminal. There will be maybe a pipeline. There will be the storage contracts, and all of those need to be aligned. But if you then look at, let's say, more the transportation and storage projects, they are, in addition to, let's say, the complexities of the rest of the value chain, they also need to deal with all the different emitters. And there's no projects that are kind of exclusive for one emitter only. So having to deal with different emitters, the timelines of their FIDs, and I think that's where a lot of risk in the value chain remains, and that is, I think, the main bridge that need to be, or the main element that needs to be bridged in the coming years. Because if you ask, and obviously, every bank will probably have a more or less similar message, but at the same time, also maybe a slightly different focus is if you look at the different risks that we look at, and obviously this is different. So if you are, without wanting to take out a particular name, but if you would be financing, let's say, Shell or Equinor or BP on a balance sheet, let's say the corporate basis, and they would fund these projects from, let's say, the corporate cash flows, then you do not have to rely on specific project financing. But if you would want to develop a project and want to finance it really on a project financing basis, you need to look at all the cash flows and the risks of that particular project. And I think that is where some of the challenges come in, because that's where you really need to not only look at, let's say, the equity and governance side, i.e., how aligned are all the stakeholders. A lot of the projects are JVs, so how aligned is everybody? Is equity available? As we sometimes see smaller developers in the market looking at developing projects that do not have the equity or not enough. So how will that proceed to FID? EPC and construction risk, I think that's a key factor. And so typically in large project financings, we would want to, as a lender, but also as a developer, you would want to allocate a number of the risks to the EPC contractors. That is first of all, EPC contractors are less prone to accepting those risks nowadays because of historical issues. But at the same time, you can do that for the onshore part, but the offshore part is typically not done on a full lump sum basis. So you need to manage that, and how are then the risks being managed? I think the key element is really the volume and the offtake risk, and basically so if you want to make a project financeable, you need to have a long-term contract in place. At least if you want to increase the leverage on those projects. And so we have seen the UK projects getting up to, let's say, 75% debt as part of the overall capex funding. But that's on the basis of, let's say, 15-year type of underlying backstop by the UK government. If you would only have a 5-year contract, the leverage you could raise may only be 25-30%, which then would impact, let's say, the equity returns that a project developer can make, and hence, the ability to get a project to FID. So, and ultimately banks finance underlying contracts. They don't really, I mean, we finance obviously the assets, but the underlying long-term contracts are really the most important for us. ESG risks, very important. It's very often overlooked, but those large project financings need to be ticking all the different boxes. So, if you're developing a project, start with this process early on. That's the only thing I can advise. Involve, let's say, the banks as to what the requirements are that need to be included in these reports. Subsurface risks, I think for everybody involved in oil and gas, it is very important to have those risks mitigated and well surveyed. And I think the last one I already alluded to that one, the project-on-project risks, and that's really the fact that you're part of a value chain and you do not control the rest of the value chain. So aligning all the stakeholders, that is really very important. And that's also one of the, let's say, cry outs I always do when I'm speaking to government officials. There's someone that needs to really coordinate those processes, and typically the governments are the best equipped for that. But in Northwest Europe, we all see a lot of governments really wanting to, or that do not want to do that. I think a good example of a government that really stepped in and started coordinating a lot was in the UK, with DESNZ stepping in the process. And you see that really helps advance those projects, because there's so many stakeholders, so many risks that need to be allocated. And yeah, the more involvement, the better it is. I think this is
Peter Paul. Just quick time check.
Yep.
About two minutes over. So whenever we're ready for Q&A.
Shannon, you're reading my mind, because this is my last slide. So
perfect.
I think this is really, if you look at the different risks in a project, how typically from a banking perspective we would look at it, and where we would prefer for those elements to lend. So obviously EPC contracting, preference for, let's say, an LSTK type of contract where risks are allocated to the contractors. If you look at the upfront volume commitments, obviously, the higher the better, because that really makes the project, the fact that you can put more leverage on it. Typically in other sectors we accept a 75% type of volume commitments, but obviously that leads to somewhat lower leverage. The ramp-up risks, obviously, preferably lower rather than higher. And I think one element, there's obviously a little bit of overlap on the different elements, but one thing that is also very often overlooked, and that's the counterparty risk. So a contract with, let's say, an emitter, let's say it's a Shell refinery in Rotterdam, triple or almost AAA rating. That contract has much more value/bankability than if you would be having a 15-year offtake with, let's say, a energy from waste company that is backstopped by, let's say, a infrastructure investor that is already leveraged at 5-6 times. So I think ultimately banks will go through all the longer-term storage contracts, assess individual contracts on their bankability, because ultimately the risk of one emitter is not the same as an emitter next door, and a 15-year contract typically will have penalties in there, and if someone would stop with, let's say, their operations, you still need to be able to have, let's say, the revenues coming from that. And there's different ways to skin the cat, but ultimately, it's an important element. Hope I'm in time, Shannon. Back to you.
Perfect. We have 10 minutes left, which I think is just enough time. Peter Paul, thank you for that presentation, specifically on the detail you paid to all the risks involved, the financing, which are very unique for CCS projects, especially in somewhere like Europe that has so many participants, both at the state and then the EU level. Okay. And with that, we have about 10 minutes. We'll invite the panelists to come back on camera. We are getting some questions from the audience here in the Q&A. I'm going to try and prioritize those as I can. And then I have some questions that we've been populating throughout the webinar. So with that, I'll jump in. So we have one question from the chat here. It's could you please explain more, share more on the logic around sharing infrastructure for CCS projects? I may actually throw that to Catalina first, and then Peter Paul. So Catalina, what are your thoughts around the benefits or cons around shared infrastructure for CCS in Europe?
Yeah, I believe this is a very relevant question. There are examples of how projects are moving. I think that sharing infrastructure in industrial clusters is definitely something which helps moving those projects. In Europe, we see many of them around ports, for instance, where you have also the shipping infrastructure available. These, I think, would also have benefits in terms of government participation. And I think what is also important for those projects is the fact that EU in particular should jump on the EU policy should build around the cross-border projects, making sure that there is alignment that the same rules apply. Without overruling, but important to setting some principle around this.
Excellent. Peter Paul, anything to add from a financing perspective from the banks?
So I think obviously the more shared infrastructure and hence, let's say, agreements that need to be dealt with for projects, the more complex a project financing will become. But having said that, we are very used to finance, let's say, projects with shared infrastructure. I think from if you take a step back, it absolutely makes sense to create shared infrastructure. If you look at, for example, the Aramis project in the Netherlands, that's basically a trunk line that's being developed that will be used to store, let's say, CO2 from emitters in the Netherlands, hopefully in due course also Belgium and Germany, and then moving that CO2 to different stores operated by, and at the moment Shell, Total, and Eni have storage licenses already in place. So it absolutely makes sense, but it does complicate, let's say, the contractual structures a little bit, but not something that is overly complicated.
Excellent. We have a few other questions from the chat. There's a few on specific rates, which I'm going to table for now. I think that may depend on the project. But there is, I think, a larger question, just given the background in Europe, and this is a question on the fate of participants if infrastructure development is lagging behind by a significant percentage. I guess I would expand this question into the current I guess success or status of CCS infrastructure and storage in Europe. I guess two general questions for the panelists. One, how are we doing today? And then two, what are you guys seeing as the main impediments to reaching some of the, say, 50 million metric ton goals by 2030? And Peter, if you'd like to perhaps take a first shot at that.
Sure. So I think there's still a lot. So I don't think we will have 50 million tons of storage by 2030. So I mean, there's a lot of plans out there, but I don't think FID will have been taken for that amount of projects. And one of the key challenges is really getting the emitters and the stores aligned. Ultimately, I mean, this is a molecule that has no value. The business model is really driven by, let's say, policies. I.e., there needs to be adequate incentivization of the developers and the owners of the stores to develop. I think the EU is taking the right steps. But it's really about bringing both parties to the table, and I think that's where, again, successful projects are bringing, let's say, everybody, both the emitters and the developers, to the table, discuss issues. How can we get to FID? What do you need? What do we need? And also, the government's really stepping in and helping out with that. And there's so much, let's say, individual storage providers can do. There's so much individual emitters can do. I think if you look at the amount of MOUs that have been signed between emitters and storage providers, you think that there's going to be, I think 10 times the volumes versus the storage. But everybody is hedging their bets, and people are just waiting with the FIDs until there's more certainty.
Katarina, anything to add?
Yes, no, the response of Peter Paul was quite on point, but what I would like to add, from a policy perspective, I think that having an obligation of making this CO2 storage capacity available has some implication also on what is feasible. It has implication. It's a serious commitment, and without the necessary measures in place and the action, is not that easy to put. So from the IOGP perspective, it was a step too much, too far, but we need to live with it to see how it's possible to make this happen, or discussing with the policymakers to see how these the derogations in place can be achieved, because it's really concerning. And I'm wondering, with this approach towards policy in mind, could not be a bad precedent also for oil and gas operation in Europe in general. I'd like really to stress the important element which Peter Paul mentioned, is that you need long-term contracts between emitters and storage operator to make this happening. And the risk to be bared by CO2 storage operators are specific from side to side. So there is need of much more support to make this happen.
And Katarina, on your presentation, you had an excellent overview of the CCS bank concept, and also some of the perhaps the contract for difference. We had a question in the chat. In that concept, with the contract for difference between, say, the EU ETS price and what the levelized cost of capture be for a project, would that be an example of, say, government support from a financing and a financial risk perspective on how some of the European nations could help deploy infrastructure?
Yeah, no, I think that the CCFD are already an instrument which have been used widely, not widely, but not been used. So we know how they work. Here is a matter of institutionalizing them a bit in the EU policy concept, and we believe that the next framework in the industrial decarbonization framework will enable this.
If I can add to that, Shannon, I think the CFD is very helpful, but it is focused on the emitters. And I think that's the subsidy they will receive. And that's where also the challenges are, because if you are, let's say, a Holcim or a Heidelberg Cement, large emitters, very professional, big departments, they will receive those subsidies and then pay out the full value chain, the capture, transport, storage. They have sufficient in-house knowledge to oversee that. But I think one of the challenges with the CFD mechanism is for the next wave. So the energy from waste, smaller biomethane producers, CHPs that may not have such large departments. And you're asking them to enter, to get the subsidies and then take a view on the full downstream project. And I think that's where this EU decarbonization bank, also the guarantee mechanism that I mentioned, will be very useful, because that will help de-risk, let's say, the value chain for those participants, because ultimately, it is a complex value chain that is being built. It's a little bit like Tetris, the old game. There's all pieces falling down, and we need to put everything together. And some are better than others in doing that.
It is amazingly complex. Well, I think we're about a minute over. I think I'm going to conclude the Q&A. Katerina or Peter Paul, any closing comments you'd like to leave the viewers with?
I think the one positive comment, because I think Katrina and myself were focusing a lot on, let's say, the challenges, but we're seeing really a lot of hard work and positive developments. And there's going to be also over summer quite a number of projects that will reach the COD. There's also other countries that we didn't mention that are really advancing. So I'm very positive about all the developments, also what's being done in the EU. But it needs and requires a lot of cooperation between the stakeholders. And I think that's where probably a bit of step up can be done.
Perfect.
Yeah, I agree. And thank you for organizing this session. The role of IPCA and IOGP in promoting and making, available the knowledge on how to make progress in CCS projects, what is required, and how policy are bouncing around the world is really a unique place. And, we need to start from this to showcase what is needed. So yeah, thank you for that.
Absolutely. Eleanor, I think that's it from our side.
Yeah, that's great. A very positive note to end the webinar on. Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Katerina and Peter Paul, for your valuable insights. And thank you, everyone else, for joining the webinar. Just to recap, the recording will be made available to all registrants, so you can watch this over, or in case you weren't able to join us today. And that's all from me. Thank you so much, everybody.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.